So this is the month of Tammuz, which Rosh Chodesh is always a happy occasion. The only thing is that in the month of Tammuz, we have the 17th of Tammuz, which starts this whole 3-week period that eventually ends up with Tisha B'Av, which has been traditionally a time of mourning over the Beis Hamikdash. And just I had this memory when I was in yeshiva. My Rosh Yeshiva said on Rosh Chodesh Tammuz, he said, on Rosh Chodesh of Tammuz, we could already hear the footsteps of the 17th of Tammuz, which is the first fast day, and then we of course end with a fast day on Tisha B'Av. And I have to say, over the years, it's gotten to the point where when it comes around again, I feel like, are you kidding me already? Are you kidding me? We're gonna do this again? You know, where's the Beis Hamikdash? Where's Mashiach? What's going on? So I hope that this year it will be different. I hope this year Tisha B'Av is a yontiv, is a holiday, is a celebratory time, and not a time of mourning. The particular astrological sign that's associated with the month of Tammuz is the crab, which, as you know, it walks sideways, and that seems to indicate something about the nature of the month. That once we get to the 17th of Tammuz, everything goes wonky, right? And it's not really until we get to after Tisha B'Av, and when we get to the 15th of that things start to correct themselves, to course correct again. But again, I hope that we have a nice straight shot all the way from here to Beit Hamikdash. Now I'm going to open up the shir for tonight. Okay. Tonight we're going to be talking about Joshua chapter 6, which is a very momentous event. We are all familiar with the Battle of Jericho and the dramatic imagery of the walls of Jericho falling down at the blasts of the shofar. But we need to understand the thing from beginning to end. And I'll begin with a certain question. How do human beings determine who's going to win in a battle of any kind, at any level? It's a very simple question. A nation prepares for war. A company enters the marketplace. A politician runs for office. An athlete enters a competition. How do we evaluate the outcome? What's the yardstick by which we measure this? So usually we look at visible things. We look at numbers and resources, technology. We look at training, fortifications, money, influence, these kinds of things. We look at walls. And walls matter. The Torah is not opposed to preparation or strength or strategy. But Joshua chapter 6 forces us to confront a deeper question. What if the decisive factor in history is often invisible? What if victories sometimes are won before a battle begins? What if walls are not the strongest thing in the story? This chapter contains one of the most famous events in Tanakh, the fall of Jericho. Even people who know almost nothing about the Bible know something about Jericho. They know about the blowing of ram's horns, the marching, the walls collapsing. But if we read the chapter carefully, what we'll discover is that the real story is not the walls. The real story is about how these walls become irrelevant. This chapter asks what actually determines victory. And the answer that it gives will shape every battle that follows throughout Sefer Yehoshua and, frankly, through the rest of the Tanakh. Now, chapter 5 ended with Joshua encountering the Sar Tzva Hashem, the commander of Hashem's army, this angelic being. And there we saw that the chain of command was clarified. Before Israel could conquer anything externally, it first had to understand who was truly leading the battle. And now we have chapter 6. It unfolds in a deliberate progression. Jericho is revealed to be psychologically defeated. We saw that all the way back in chapter 2. Hashem declares the city already given to Israel. This strange battle plan is revealed. The number 7 dominates the chapter. Israel marches around the city in silence. Rachav is rescued along with her family. Jericho becomes destroyed, but the objects within become consecrated to Hashem. And Joshua preserves the memory of the miracle for future generations. And they're not separate episodes. It's just one argument. What this chapter is teaching us is a single principle from multiple angles, that before Israel learns warfare, it has to learn the source of victory. We take a look at the first verse. It says, "V'Yericho sogeret u'musugeret mipnei b'nei Yisrael ein yotzev ein ba." Jericho was tightly shut because of the children of Israel. None went out and none came in. At first glance, this sounds like military preparedness. Exactly what we would expect. A fortified city closes its gates. That's normal. But this verse immediately raises a question for us. Why is Jericho closed? Is it because the city is confident or because it's terrified? And to answer this, we have to remember the words of Rachav to the spies. She tells them, this is in chapter 2, verse 9, Yadati ki natan Hashem lechem et haaretz. I know that Hashem has given you the land, v'chi nafla eimatchem aleinu, and that the terror of you has fallen upon us. And then she says, V'lo kama od ruach be'ish mipnechem. No spirit remains in any man because of you. Notice something about these verses, that Rachav is not speaking about herself. She's describing the psychological tenor of an entire civilization, an entire society, an entire land. Already in chapter 5, we encounter a similar phenomenon. After the crossing of the Jordan, we're told, Vayimas levavam, their hearts melted, V'lo haya bam od ruach, and there remained no spirit in them. This is one of the recurring patterns of the Tanakh. We see that civilizations fall apart internally before they collapse externally. Egypt collapses psychologically before the sea closes on the soldiers of Pharaoh. Midian collapses psychologically before Gidon attacks. Goliath collapses psychologically before the stone is launched from David's sling. And Jericho here collapses psychologically before the walls fall. The battle hasn't started yet, but the city has already begun to lose. So when we talk about the gates of Jericho being closed, that's not closed in preparation for a war, thinking that anything is going to help the situation. That's Jericho being closed for business. And this takes us back 40 years. When the spies returned from the land, 10 spies saw giants, 10 spies saw walls, 10 spies saw impossibilities. But Caleb, he saw something else entirely. He said, Alona ale, v'yarashnu ota ki yachol nuchal la. We shall surely go up and inherit it, for we are surely able to overcome it. That's in Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. Now, how is he so confident about that when everybody else is claiming that the conquest of the land of Canaan would be impossible? Well, the Sforno explains that Caleb understood something that the others that had been sent to spy out the land had failed to grasp. The inhabitants were already frightened. And fear weakens resistance. Fear undermines judgment. Fear can destroy a nation long before an army arrives. And now Rachav is confirming precisely what Caleb understood 40 years earlier. And the irony is extraordinary. Rachav heard about the miracles, but these spies, the Midrash tells us, who are these spies? It's Pinchas and Caleb. These spies hadn't heard about these miracles. They lived through them. So Rachav comes to the same conclusion as Caleb, but the spies did not. The other 10 did not. Why not? Because the issue was never about information. It was about the interpretation of that information. It was never about evidence. It was about the response to the evidence. Right? This remains true today. This is exactly how life is today. People often imagine that if only they had enough evidence, then certainty will follow. But the Tanakh repeatedly demonstrates otherwise for us. Pharaoh saw evidence. The spies saw evidence. But evidence alone does not determine what your response should be. Character determines response. Humility determines response. Alignment with Hashem determines response. And this brings us to one of the most beautiful parallels in this whole chapter. Rachav explains why everyone is afraid. Ki shamanu et asher hovish Hashem et mei yam suf. Because we've heard, this is chapter 2, verse 10, we've heard how Hashem dried up the waters of the Sea of Reeds, of the Red Sea. The fear begins at the sea. It doesn't begin with Israel's weapons. It doesn't begin with Israel's military or with Israel's numbers. It begins with Hashem. I want you to notice the literary parallel. At the sea, we read the following thing: "The hamayim lahem choma." This is in Numbers chapter 14, verse 22. Hamayim lahem choma. The waters were a wall for them. Miminam umismolam, on their right and on their left. At the sea, Hashem made the sea into the water into walls. He built walls for Israel. At Jericho, men built walls against Israel. One set of walls stands and the other falls. The difference is very significant. One set rests upon the Creator himself, and the other one rests solely upon itself. This is not an ancient lesson alone, because modern civilization also builds walls, financial walls, political walls, military walls, technological walls, or psychological walls. The Torah never says that these things are worthless. The Torah does say, as we see here, that they're not ultimate. A civilization that trusts its walls more than the one who governs history, that civilization has already begun making Jericho's mistake. Now, the chapter then presents an astonishing parallel. Rachav says, Yedati ki natan Hashem lechem et haaretz, chapter 2, verse 9. I know that Hashem has given you the land. And later in our chapter, chapter 6, verse 2, Hashem says, Re'ei natati biyadecha et Jericho. See, I have given Jericho into your hand. Notice the tense. Not I will give, but I have given. The woman whose home was in that wall and the Creator of the world are saying exactly the same thing. Only the city of Jericho disagrees. But who's really conquering Jericho? If the battle is already won, there's another question that immediately emerges. Who won the battle? Who's actually conquering Jericho? And to answer that question, we have to return to the end of chapter 5. Yehoshua lifts his eyes and sees a mysterious figure. This is chapter 5, verse 13. Vehine ish omed lenegdo. And behold, a man standing opposite him, v'charbo shlufa biyado, with his sword drawn in his hand. That image should sound familiar. We've seen it. But we've seen another famous drawn sword in Tanakh, in the episode of Bilam. In Numbers chapter 22, verse 31, it says, Vayar et malach Hashem nitzav baderech. He saw the angel of Hashem standing in the road, with the sword drawn in his hand. In both cases, heaven intervenes. In both cases, human beings believe that they understand reality. And in both cases, the drawn sword represents impending judgment. Joshua asks, Halanu ata im litzarenu. Now, this person, this figure, this angelic figure, looks like a warrior. So Joshua asks the question that we have to ask when we see somebody who is locked and loaded like that. He says, friend or foe? Are you with us? Or are you with our enemies? That's chapter 5, verse 13. And it's a completely natural question. Which side are you on? But the answer to that question, as we saw, is shocking. What's the answer? Lo. No. Not I am for Israel. Not I am for Jericho. Just no. The question itself, the premise of the question itself is rejected. The Sar Tzva Hashem, the general of the angelic army of Hashem, immediately reframes the entire discussion. The issue is not whether Hashem is on Israel's side. The issue is whether Israel is on Hashem's side. And that's one of the deepest lessons in this entire Sefer. Human beings constantly attempt to recruit God to their cause. But Tanakh repeatedly reverses the question. The question is not, is God supporting me? The question is, am I aligned with the will of Hashem? So then that angelic figure explains verse 14, chapter 5, Ki ani sar tzva Hashem. I am the commander of the army of Hashem. Now, my friends, notice the implication. The battle is not fundamentally Joshua's battle. It's not fundamentally Israel's battle. The battle belongs to Hashem. The city belongs to Hashem. The victory belongs to Hashem because history belongs to Hashem. And then comes the command, Shal na'alcha mi'al raglecha. Remove your shoes from upon your foot, exactly as it was with Moses at the burning bush. Why? Because before warfare comes holiness. Before conquest comes revelation. Before power comes submission to Hashem. Before the walls will fall, Joshua has to understand who is truly leading the charge. And now the strange battle plan that we have here begins to make sense. Why are there priests? What do Kohanim need to be there to go to battle for? Why are there shofarot? Right? Why are there these ram's horns? What do you need a shofar for? Why is the Holy Ark at the center? Because this is not being presented as an ordinary military operation. The formation that we see really resembles a sacred procession more than a siege. The ark leads, Hashem leads, and Israel follows. Right? We saw in chapter 3, the ark leads Israel through the Jordan River. Chapter 4, the ark stands at the center of the miracle. Chapter 5, the Sar Tzva Hashem establishes the chain of command. And chapter 6, the ark leads the conquest itself. Israel is not following Joshua into battle. Israel is following Hashem into history. And once that is understood, we're ready for the next question. Why does the number 7 dominate every detail of this battle plan? Why do we have 7 priests, 7 shofars, 7 days? Why are there 7 circuits on the 7th day? Now, the answer to that question takes us back, not to Egypt, not to Sinai. It takes us all the way back to creation itself. Once we understand who's leading the battle, this is the question. Why does the battle look like this? If Hashem wants to destroy Jericho, he can destroy Jericho. The walls could fall instantly. The city could surrender. The inhabitants could flee. It could be a very natural thing. But instead, we encounter one of the strangest battle plans in all of military history. The verse says, chapter 6, verse 4, V'shiv'a kohanim yisu shiva shofrot hayovlim lifnei ha'aron. 7 priests shall carry 7 ram's horn trumpets before the ark. And then, uvayom hashvi tisobu et ha'ir sheva pa'amim. On the 7th day, you shall circle the city 7 times. The repetition is impossible to miss. 7 priests, 7 shofars, 7 days, 7 circuits, again and again and again. The chapter is drawing our attention to something. The obvious question is, why 7? Why 7? So the Radak explains that the number 7 points us back to creation. That's certainly true. We know that creation unfolded through 7 days. Shabbat is the 7th day. Shemitah, the sabbatical year, is the 7th year. The Jubilee year, the Yovel, emerges after 7 cycles of these 7 years. So throughout the Tanakh, the number 7 represents completion and divine order. But perhaps the chapter is teaching us something deeper. The number 7 doesn't merely remind us that Hashem created the world like once. It reminds us that Hashem remains present within the world that he created. A creation was not a one-time event. The Creator did not build reality and walk away. The God who created nature continues to govern nature. The God who created history continues to govern history. The God who created nations continues to govern nations. And that's exactly what the lesson of Jericho is. That's exactly what Jericho teaches. The people of Jericho trusted their walls, the engineering, military strength. They trusted fortifications. In other words, they trusted what they could see, what they could understand. And human beings have always done the same thing, always do the same thing. Ancient civilizations trusted walls. Modern civilizations trust firewalls, trust systems and technology and governments and economies, markets, institutions, military power. The forms change, but the temptation remains identical. To mistake the visible structure for the source of stability. And Jericho becomes a public demonstration that the world still belongs to its creator. The repeated sevens announce, this is my world. This is my history. This is my victory. Now, the walls ultimately are going to fall on Shabbat, which is an extraordinary thing. Because what it means is that the city falls on the day that commemorates creation. They collapse on the same day that proclaims that the universe still belongs to its maker. So now the lesson becomes impossible to miss. The God who created the world remains present within the world. My friends, this is not merely a lesson for Israel. This is humanity's lesson. And nowhere is that contrast clearer than the comparison between Rachav, the person of Jericho, and the city of Jericho. All the inhabitants of Jericho and Rachav included heard the same reports. They knew about Egypt. They knew about what happened at the Red Sea. Both sets feared. But one of these trusted Hashem, trusted the Creator, and the others trusted the walls. One survives, the rest are destroyed. Even the description of the miracle itself points in this direction. Hashem tells Yoshua, this is an amazing thing. V'nafle chomat ha'ir tachteha. This is in verse 5. The wall of the city shall fall beneath itself. Very significant wording. It's unusual. Why doesn't it simply say the wall will fall? So the Gemara explains in Brachos, page 54b, Chomat Yericho shokat haita. Jericho's walls were extraordinarily thick. As a matter of fact, according to Chazal, they were as thick as they were high. If these are like big fortifications, it's not just, we're not just talking about the height, we're talking about width as well, thickness. If they had merely toppled outward, they would still have formed an enormous obstacle to get over. And that would have been the same thing if they had toppled inward. So instead, they sank tachtea, beneath themselves. The obstacle disappeared because the miracle is precisely fitted to the need. The creator who governs nature also governs circumstances. Nothing's random. Nothing is accidental. Nothing is beyond the authority of Hashem. Everything in this section points towards the same conclusion, that the number 7 is not merely a reminder of creation, but a declaration that the creator remains present within creation. Now, if the number 7 is strange, there's another detail to the story that's even stranger, which is the silence. Joshua commands the people in verse 10, "Va'atem lo tariu v'lo tashmiu et kolchem v'lo yetze mipichem davar." You shall not. Well, tariu is like a specific blast that is made by the shofar. You shall not let your voice be heard, and no word shall leave your mouth. Very, very comprehensive command. It's not just about don't scream, don't shout, don't blow the, don't not. It's not just remain quiet. Rather, no word shall leave your mouth. So, why? What's that about? What difference does it make whether they talk? What threat does conversation pose? Just imagine the scene. Day 1, nothing happens. The walls stand. Day 2, nothing happens. The walls stand. Day 3, still nothing. Day 4, still nothing. Day 5, still nothing. What conversation would naturally begin? The answer is the same conversation that began 40 years earlier. Why are we doing this? How is this supposed to work? What's the plan? What if nothing happens? What if this fails? The Torah has already shown us where that conversation can lead. The spies speak, the nation speaks, the nation complains, the nation rebels, an entire generation loses the land through words, has to wander the desert for 40 years because of that. And now a new generation stands before its inheritance, and the instruction is the exact opposite. No word shall leave your mouth. So we have to understand something. This is not merely tactical silence. It's a type of spiritual discipline. The previous generation interprets reality before allowing that reality to unfold. They judge the situation before they trusted Hashem. They've evaluated the promise, but through the lens of the obstacle. But this generation is being trained completely differently. Walk, trust, wait. Don't narrate the outcome before the story is finished. Very important lesson here for modern life. Most anxiety is an attempt to finish the story before it happens. We create conversations with ourselves. What if, what if, what if? We build entire futures from possibilities. We argue with realities that don't exist yet. The command at Jericho is not a command against thinking. It's a command against premature interpretation. Walk. Do what Hashem commanded. Allow his reality to unfold. And then the end of the verse becomes especially significant. It says, Ad yom amri aleichem hariu. Until the day that I tell you to blast and to cry out. Right? A trua is a type of sound that's made by a shofar, but it represents an outcry. Right? Until the day I tell you, which will be the 7th day, at that point you're going to give you're going to give a shout. That's verse 10. The issue is about authority. Speech is not bad, But who determines the moment of speech? Who determines the moment of action or victory? The answer is the same lesson which is taught by the Tzvar Hashem, the angelic general of God's army. Hashem leads, Israel follows. Hashem commands silence, Israel remains silent. Hashem commands speech, commands them to cry out, they'll cry out. The conquest succeeds this time because Israel has now learned obedience. One generation, 40 years earlier, talked itself out of the land. The next generation walks silently into the land. And it's precisely at this point in the chapter that the narrative suddenly pauses and returns to one remarkable woman that we know, the woman who understood all of this before anyone else in Jericho, Rachav. At the very moment that Jericho is about to fall, the narrative suddenly pauses. The walls are about to collapse. The city is about to be destroyed. This conquest is reaching its climax, and yet Joshua's attention turns elsewhere. His attention turns to a single house, to a single family, to a single woman. Before Jericho is destroyed, Joshua commands, V'et Rachav hazona, V'et Beit Aviha, V'et kol asher la t'chayu. That's verse 17. Rachav. Now, the word is hazona. That could be the harlot. That could be the courtesan. That could be the provider. Her father's household, and all that belongs to her shall live. We'll look at this verse. At first glance, it appears pretty straightforward. A promise was made. We remember the promise from chapter 2. The promise is now being fulfilled, but a problem immediately emerges. You have to think about this, because earlier that we were told, V'hi yoshevet b'choma. In chapter 2, in verse 15, it says that she lived, essentially her house was built into the wall of Jericho. You see the problem? If Rachav lives in the wall and the wall falls, how is she going to survive? So the Radak answers this question directly. He explains that the miracle itself was selective. This is one opinion, meaning that the walls collapsed, but the section associated with Rachav remains standing long enough. I mean, basically, the way he describes it is that it's not that the walls of Jericho fell; it's that part of the wall fell in order to allow the Israelites to enter the city. So what we see is that the same miracle that brings judgment upon the city of Jericho also brings salvation to Rachav. Not all of the commentators agree with that interpretation. But it's an interesting thought. The Vilna Gaon offers a different approach. He says that Rachav's house was built, let's say, into the wall in the sense of using the wall as one of the walls of the house, but it wasn't structurally inside the wall. So when the wall fell, her house remains intact and exposed. So whichever explanation we adopt, the underlying lesson remains the same. And it's a lesson that we have to understand every time we encounter miraculous events in Tanakh. Miracles that Hashem performs are precise. Hashem is not merely destroying walls. He's also distinguishing, judging, rescuing, separating one reality from another. Now, this brings us to something extraordinarily important. Rachav and Jericho received the same information, right? But Rachav responds completely differently. Jericho closes its gates. Jericho closes itself. Rachav opened herself. They retreat behind the walls. She opens her homes to the spies. The inhabitants of Jericho, they double down on their old reality. But Rachav brings herself into alignment with the new reality. And this is one of the most important themes in the entire chapter. What's the dividing line between the peoples here? It's not ethnicity or nationality. It's about connection to Hashem. That's precisely what the Tzva Hashem taught Joshua. The question is not which side are you on. It's, are you on Hashem's side? Rachav understood this before anybody else in Jericho. Because, and she says, one of the great theological declarations in the entire Sefer Yoshua, in the entire Tanakh. She says, Ki Hashem Elokeichem hu Elokim b'shamayim mima'al v'al ha'aretz mitachat. Verse 11 in chapter 2. For Hashem, your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. That's the recognition. Think about who's saying these words. This is not Moshe Rabbeinu. This is not Yehoshua. This is not a prophet, not a Kohen. It's a Canaanite woman. Right? I mean, and it's one of the great ironies in the Tanakh that outsiders often recognize truth that insiders take for granted. Don't forget Jethro, who recognizes Hashem. I think Eliezer, the servant of Abraham, was the first person to ever say in the Tanakh is recorded as saying Baruch Hashem. And then Jethro also utters this the same way. Ruth recognizes Hashem. Naaman recognizes Hashem. And Rachav here recognizes Hashem. Because sometimes distance allows for a kind of clarity, whereas familiarity and closeness breeds a kind of blindness. Right? Rachav sees what Jericho can't. She sees what the spies of Israel failed to see 40 years earlier. And she understands that the central fact of history is Hashem. And once she understands that, everything changes. And we see in verse 25 a fascinating statement. Fascinating statement. V'yet Rachav hazona, v'yet Beit Aviha, v'yet kol asher la, hechia Yoshua. Rachav, her father's household, and all that belonged to her, Joshua gave life. It's like he revived them, like he gave them life. Look at that wording. The verse could have said he spared them, he rescued, protect. Instead, it says hechiyah. He gave life. Why? Radak explains that Rachav is not merely spared execution. She and her family are brought into Israel. They are sustained. They're protected. They're integrated. She receives a future. In other words, she didn't merely survive. She was transformed. And the distinction is very profound. There's a big difference between being rescued from something and being brought into something. Rachav experiences both. She's rescued from destruction, but she's also brought into the history of this covenant, which is now entering history. And the Gemara takes us even further. The Gemara in Megillah, page 14b, says, Shmona Nevi'im behem kohanim yatsu mirachav hazona. 8 prophets who were also Kohanim descended from Rachav. Same Gemara records a tradition that we have that Yehoshua, that Joshua himself married Rachav. The woman who lived in Jericho becomes part of Israel. The woman who once lived in the wall becomes part of the future. The woman who stood on the outside becomes part of the inside. And perhaps this is why the narrative spends so much time on her, because Rachav embodies the possibility that stands before all humanity. Right? The Noahide message here is that Jericho represents one response to reality, and Rachav represents another. Jericho hears and resists. Rachav hears and aligns herself. Jericho clings to its power. Rachav submits to truth. Jericho falls. Rachav rises. And there's a beautiful parallel as well. I want you to notice something. You'd think that when you go and conquer a city, usually the warriors who conquer divide the spoils amongst themselves. Jericho is the first city in Canaan that's encountered by Israel. Rachav is the first individual of Canaan who was transformed by the message of Israel. Jericho becomes the first city that's consecrated to Hashem. Rachav becomes the first household devoted to Hashem. Jericho is, in a sense, the first fruit of conquest. And Rachav and her family is, in a certain sense, the first fruits of the nations. So, why does Jericho itself belong entirely to Hashem? Why is Israel forbidden from treating its victory as an ordinary spoil, right? It said the city becomes cherem, it becomes something that's completely cut off and consecrated for Hashem. And this is a principle that we find, a fundamental principle that we find in all of Torah. It's called Reshit, the beginning. And it's the idea that the first belongs to Hashem. Okay? After the walls fall, Joshua says, "V'haita ha'ir cherem hi v'chol asher ba l'Hashem." The city will be consecrated, and all that is within it shall belong to Hashem. And then comes a warning: "V'rak atem shamru min hacherem pen tachrimu v'lekachtem min hacherem." In verse 18, he says, "But guard yourself from all the consecrated things, lest you take from the consecrated things." So this is a very powerful warning. The battle has been won. The city is conquered. The treasure of the city is sitting there. But Israel is forbidden to treat it as spoil. Why is that? Because of this principle of Reshit, that the beginning of anything belongs to Hashem. Again and again, we encounter this pattern. The firstborn, the Bechor, the first fruits, the Bikurim, Reshit Hagez, the first shearing of a sheep, the first portion of dough, challah. The first and best are returned to their source. Why? Because the Torah insists that before man enjoys blessing, he has to acknowledge where blessing comes from. This is why we make blessings over food. Hashemayim shemayim laHashem v'ha'aretz natan levnei adam. Right? The heavens belong to Hashem, and the land has been given to mankind. But there's another verse that says, "L'Hashem ha'aretz umalo'ah," that the earth and all of its fullness belong to Hashem. So what is it? Either the earth and all of its fullness belongs to Hashem, or the earth has been given to mankind. So Chazal tell us that's what the one verse applies to before you have made a bracha on something, and that is where the earth belongs to Hashem, meaning everything down here. And the other verse where we say "V'ha'aretz natan levnei adam," that the earth has been given to mankind, that's after you have made the blessing. Now it becomes yours. Right? The first portion sanctifies everything that follows. So a farmer brings the first fruit, not because Hashem doesn't need fruit, but man needs gratitude. That's why a firstborn is sanctified. Hashem doesn't require ownership. He already owns everything. But we need to remember, everything belongs to Hashem. So this principle teaches us not to forget it. Jericho, therefore, occupies a unique position because not just another city, it's the first city. It's the first city conquered in the land, the first victory, the first tangible realization of the promise made to Abraham centuries earlier. So Jericho belongs to Hashem. It becomes the Bikurim, the first fruits of the conquest, of the military victory. And before Israel benefits from the land, Israel must acknowledge the giver of the land. So now we can see how this connects to the opening of the chapter. Hashem says, "Re'ei natati biyadcha et Jericho," in verse 2. "Behold, I have given Jericho into your hands." So what we can understand from this is that if Hashem gave it, then the first portion returns to him. The entire chapter has been teaching this lesson. This city was already defeated before the battle began. The Sar Tzava Hashem revealed who the true commander was. The ark led the procession. The number 7 pointed back to creation. The walls fell through divine intervention. But now comes the final lesson. Do not misunderstand what just happened. Do not imagine that the victory belongs to you. Do not transform gift into possession. Do not turn blessing into entitlement. Jericho is Reshit, is a first, and the first belongs to Hashem. You might be familiar with a verse from Psalms. This is in chapter 111, verse 10. Reshit Chachma Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of Hashem. Why beginning? Because beginnings establish direction. The first step determines the path. This first city determines how all future cities should be understood. Because we're going to see that warfare becomes more conventional as we go on. As you go on through Tanakh, you're going to see battles that are much more similar to what we understand to be warfare today. But still, the basic framework of understanding has to be there. This victory determines how all future victories will be understood. The first success, the way that's handled, determines whether success will produce gratitude or arrogance. That's why Joshua's warning not to take any of the spoil is so severe. Because the real danger here is about forgetting. Basic theme in the Torah is that spiritual failure begins when blessing obscures its source. People like, how things are going, and then they forget who gave it to them. And we're warned about this in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 17. It says, you should not think that my strength and the might of my hand have made for me this wealth. We have this phrase that I grew up with. It was called a self-made man. He's a self-made man. My friends, there's no such thing as a self-made man. Everything comes from Hashem. It's the most easy mistake to make, though. Right? Success creates a kind of amnesia. The stronger that we become, it's easier to forget the source of our strength. That's why Jericho stands at the beginning of this conquest. Because before Israel conquers this land, they have to know how to understand conquest. They have to learn gratitude and humility before they receive blessing and power. So we'll get to the last part of this chapter, I think, the next time that we get together. But I just wanted to end up with a few thoughts here. The question that remains with us here is what walls exist in our lives? Everyone has walls. The deeper question is, what do we trust? Do we trust our strength, our plans, our intuitions, our resources, or do we trust the one who governs history itself? The Battle of Jericho teaches that victory belongs neither to the strongest walls or to the strongest armies. It belongs to those people who bring themselves into connection and alignment with Hashem's world, Hashem's reality. The reality that he governs nature and history and nations and individuals. The walls of Jericho fell because that reality was stronger than their walls. And those people who attach themselves to Hashem discover that the greatest victories are often won long before the walls begin to fall.